All right, poker fans, welcome back to the Run Deep in Poker Tournaments podcast.
Yeah.
We're all about cracking the code to consistent tournament success. And today we've got some serious firepower to help us do just that.
You know what's fascinating about tournament poker is that it's not just about winning when you have the best hand. It's about navigating those tricky spots, minimizing damage when luck isn't on your side, and capitalizing ruthlessly when it is.
Yeah, and that's precisely what we're diving into today. We've got Johnathan Little's video, 3HACKS to run deep in more tournaments as our guide. And let me tell you, this guy does not hold back. He's giving us the straight goods on how to outlast the field and make those deep runs we all dream of.
And his approach is all about understanding the pivotal moments that can make or break your tournament. I mean, he doesn't just throw out tips. He explains the strategic reasoning behind each move so you can adapt them to your own game.
Okay, so let's jump right in.
Yeah.
Hack number 1 is a real gut check. Stop getting stacked when you get cooler. I think every poker player knows the pain of having a seemingly strong hand absolutely demolished by an even stronger one.
Ah, yes. The dreaded It's like you're cruising along with the set feeling invincible and suddenly, bam, you're staring down the barrel of a flush. It's tough because it feels like you did everything right, but the poker gods had other plans.
And that's where things get interesting. Little uses this example where a player calls an all-in bet with a set of sevens only to see their opponent flip over a flush. I mean, talk about a nightmare scenario.
Oh, it's a classic example of how emotional attachment to a hand can lead to disaster. The key here is detaching your ego from the decision-making process. It's about recognizing that even a strong hand can become a liability when the situation changes.
So what's the solution? Do we just fold every hand pre-flop and hope for the best?
Not quite. It's about understanding relative hand strength. A set of sevens might be a monster in one situation, but if the board screams flush, you need to reassess. Little gives a contrasting example where a player actually folds pocket kings pre-flop because of a potential flush draw. It seems crazy, right?
Yeah. Folding pocket kings. That's like poker heresy. But I'm starting to see his point. If you're up against multiple opponents who are all drawing to a flush, those kings might not be so mighty after all.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that hand values are fluid. They change based on the board texture, the number of opponents, and their potential ranges. Folding pocket kings in that spot might seem counterintuitive, but it's a masterful display of discipline and long-term thinking.
It's about choosing your battles, knowing when to cut your losses and live to fight another day. Speaking of choosing your battles, let's move on to hack number 2. Give up on bluffs more often. This one feels particularly tough because it goes against that instinct to never give up.
This hack is all about recognizing when a bluff has run its course. It's common to feel committed to a bluff after investing bets on the flop and turn, but sometimes the river card throws a wrench in the works.
Right. Little lays out this scenario where a player is bluffing with ace-2 of spades on a jack-4-3 flop with one spade. The turn brings another spade, completing a possible flush draw, and the player barrels along, hoping to scare their opponent off. But then the river is a harmless 3 of hearts, which doesn't change the board texture much at all.
That's the moment of truth the opponent has called bets on the flop and turn, indicating they likely have something decent, maybe a jack or even a better hand.
So by the river, our bluffer is essentially stuck. Continuing to bet is likely throwing good money after bad. But folding feels like admitting defeat.
And that's where the discipline of a seasoned pro comes into play, recognizing that the situation has changed and folding becomes the most logical, albeit painful decision.
It's a powerful reminder that folding isn't always weakness. It's about conserving your chips for situations where you have a higher chance of success.
You can think of it like this: folding a hopeless bluff is like dodging a bullet. It might sting in the moment, but it saves you from potentially devastating damage.
So we've learned to avoid getting crushed when coolers strike, and to know when to fold those stubborn bluffs. Now, let's dive into the fun part, where we turn those well-timed folds and strategic plays into cold, hard cash.
Now this is where we separate the contenders from the pretenders. Hack number 3 is all about maximizing your profits when you have the best hand value bet relentlessly.
This is the part of poker that gets me fired up.
Yeah.
It's not just about winning, it's about extracting maximum value from your opponents. And Little introduces this concept of thin value, which sounds intriguing.
Yeah, think of thin value as betting for value in situations where your hand might not be the absolute nuts, but it's still very likely ahead. It's about finding those spots where your opponent might have a decent hand, but is willing to pay you off if you play it right.
Okay, Little uses a great example of a player holding king 10 on a king-queen jack board. It's a solid hand, but it's not exactly the nuts.
Right, against a weak player, though, this is a prime opportunity to make a thin value bet. Why? Because many recreational players tend to be overly cautious with strong hands and overly aggressive with weak ones.
So if they're calling your bet with a hand like queen jack or even just a jack, you're basically printed money.
Precisely, and that's the beauty of thin value betting. You're exploiting your opponent's tendencies and turning a seemingly marginal hand into a profitable situation.
This is like unlocking a secret level of poker.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see the game in a whole new light.
It's about recognizing those subtle opportunities where your hand might not be the strongest, but it's strong enough to extract value from the right opponent.
Okay, I'm already feeling more confident about my value betting skills, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. We've got a lot more ground to cover in Johnathan Little's video.
Welcome back to the Run Deep in Poker Tournaments podcast, where we're turning those early exits into deep runs and final table dreams.
We're on fire today. We've already broken down 2 of Johnathan Little's killer hacks from his video 3HACKS to run deep in more tournaments. Dodging disaster when coolers hit and knowing when to fold those tempting bluffs.
Right. These are the fundamental building blocks of a solid tournament strategy. They're all about minimizing those soul-crushing losses that can derail your entire run.
Let's rewind for a second and take another look at that first hack. Stop getting stacked when you get cooler. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the idea of folding pocket kings pre-flop.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough concept to swallow, especially for those of us who are used to playing those big pairs aggressively. But remember, context is everything in poker.
Okay, so you're saying those kings might be vulnerable in certain situations, even if they look pretty darn strong on paper?
Exactly. Little emphasized that folding pocket kings, while seemingly crazy, becomes the right play when facing a potential flush draw against multiple opponents. Imagine this, you're playing against 3 other players, and the flop comes down with 2 hearts. Now 2 more hearts hit the turn and river.
Ouch, suddenly those kings are looking a lot less impressive.
Right. The odds of one of your opponents hitting a flush are significantly increased in that scenario. Holding on to those kings with the hope that everyone else missed their flush draw is a recipe for disaster.
So it's not just about the strength of your hand, it's about recognizing those danger zones where a strong hand can quickly turn into a losing one.
Precisely. You have to consider the board texture, the number of opponents, and their potential ranges. It's a dynamic process that requires constant evaluation and adjustment.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's easy to get fixated on your own cards, but understanding the overall context of the hand is crucial for making those tough decisions.
Absolutely. And that same principle applies to our second hack, give up on bluffs more often. Sometimes the river card completely changes the story, turning a promising bluff into a lost cause.
I remember that example Little used where the player was bluffing with ace-2 of spades on a jack-4-3 flop with 1 spade. The turn brought another spade, giving him a potential flush draw, and he kept firing bets, hoping to represent a strong hand, but then the river bricked out with a 3 of hearts changing nothing.
In that situation, the opponent has already called 2 bets, indicating they likely have a decent hand. The river card doesn't improve the bluffer's hand or change the story much at all.
Right, so continuing to bluff on the river is just asking for trouble. The opponent is unlikely to fold, and our bluffer is risking a big chunk of their stack on a bluff that's probably going to fail.
It's like trying to force a square peg into a round hole. It's just not going to work. Sometimes, the best play is to accept that your bluff has run its course and move on.
Yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow, but I'm starting to see how these well-timed folds can be just as important as big wins. They keep us in the game and give us more opportunities to capitalize when we have a strong hand.
And that leads us perfectly into our third hack, where we turn those strategic folds and calculated plays into profit value bet. Relentlessly, this is where the magic happens.
This is the part I've been waiting for.
Yeah.
I love the idea of thin value betting, where you're extracting value from opponents even when your hand might not be the absolute nuts.
It's a subtle art that separates the good players from the great ones. It's about recognizing those situations where your hand might not be the strongest, but it's strong enough to make your opponent pay.
Okay, so let's revisit that example with King 10 on a King-Queen Jack board. It's not a monster hand, but against the right opponent, it's a value betting goldmine.
Right. Remember, many recreational players tend to telegraph their hand strength through their bet sizing. If they're betting small, they're likely weak. If they're betting big, they're likely strong. A skilled player can use this information to their advantage.
So if they're calling my bet on that King-Queen Jack board with a weak hand like Queen Jack or even just a Jack, I'm basically printing money.
Exactly. You're exploiting their tendencies and turning a seemingly marginal hand into a profitable situation.
This is incredible. I'm starting to see how mastering these 3 hacks can really elevate my tournament game.
Absolutely. And we're just scratching the surface here. We'll be back with part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll explore even more nuances and strategies for these game-changing hacks. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to the Run Deep in Poker Tournaments podcast, folks. We're wrapping up our deep dive into Johnathan Little's 3 hacks to run deep in more tournaments.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, from dodging coolers to folding those stubborn bluffs.
And now it's time to bring home the bacon with hack number 3. Value bet. Relentlessly. This is where we turn those strategic plays into cold, hard cash.
Right. It's about maximizing our profits when we have the best hand. And that's where the concept of thin value comes into play.
I'm still fascinated by this idea. It's like finding hidden treasure in those seemingly ordinary hands.
Remember that example with King 10 on a King Queen Jack board? It's not the nuts, but it's a prime opportunity for a thin value bet, especially against the right opponent.
Okay, let's break this down. Why is that hand so good for thin value betting?
Well, it's all about understanding player tendencies. Many recreational players, especially those who haven't grasped the concept of relative hand strength, will overplay hands like Queen Jack or even just a Jack on that board.
They see a pair, they get excited, and they're willing to pay you off even if their hand is second best.
Exactly, and that's where you, as the savvy player, swoop in and extract that sweet, sweet value. You're not just winning the pot, you're maximizing your winnings.
It's like you're playing chess while they're playing checkers.
Right.
You're thinking several steps ahead, anticipating their moves and setting them up for a fall.
That's a great analogy. It's about exploiting those subtle leaks in their game and turning them into profit opportunities.
This is so much more than just betting big when you have a strong hand. It's about understanding the psychology of your opponents and using that information to your advantage.
And that's what separates the consistent winners from the players who are constantly blaming bad luck. It's about making strategic decisions that tilt the odds in your favor.
Okay, so to recap, Johnathan Little's 3 hacks for running deep in tournaments are: 1, stop getting stacked when you get cooler; 2, give up on bluffs more often; and 3, value bet relentlessly.
Master these 3 hacks and you'll be well on your way to dominating those tournaments.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've gained a whole new level of understanding about tournament poker strategy.
And remember, it's not just about memorizing these concepts, it's about applying them at the tables. Study those hand examples, analyze your own play, and keep refining your game.
Huge thanks to Johnathan Little for sharing his wisdom, and to all of you for joining us on the Run Deep in Poker Tournaments podcast.
Keep those cards flying, and we'll see you at the final table.
Thanks for listening to the Run Deep podcast.